Good afternoon. Happy Tuesday. Welcome to Quarantine Story Time. I'm Charlotte, and we're reading from War and Peace while many of us in the US have to still shelter in place because of COVID-19. So, to pass the time, some classic literature seemed in order, and since I rarely have enough time on my hands to get through a book this thick, and all 4 pounds of book, I thought since I had nothing but time right now, or very little else other than time, to give it a shot and asked you all to join me on this journey. So thank you so much for those of you who've been watching and those who are maybe first time jumping in. We are in Volume 1, Part 2, Sections 3 and 4 today of War and Peace, which may sound like we've made some progress. In actuality, we've gotten about that far. And that's page 122 of over 1,200. So yeah, we're about a 10th of the way through. Yes, a 10th. So that being said, there's lots of characters, lots of character development happening. So I can't recap too much. Right now, it looks like we are out at the front in Austria and Braunau. So some of the characters, Prince Andrei has joined a battalion there. Also, the rather reckless Officer Dolokhov, who was demoted for some of his crazy shenanigans with Pierre in Petersburg. He is there as a soldier. So we're there now. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. I'll try to answer that as we go. But also, you can always catch up on anything that you've missed by checking out my channel. There's a playlist for War and Peace, and they're all numbered. It's all by date, obviously, but it's also numbered as far as the section. So you can catch up, or if there's a day you missed, you can see if there was anything happening with any of your favorite characters. As we've started developing the different personalities, some characters seem to be more interesting or perhaps more favorited than others. So feel free to let me know who you're liking the most, and let's just jump back in. Let's see, like I said, I have the chat going, and yeah, we're only maybe a 10th of the way through. There's a bunch of at the back, there's a bunch of notes. So to get past the appendixes into the actual end of the book is page 1215 in this translation, and we're on 122 today. So yes, we've made it through a 10th of the way. So congratulations. We only have to do this for, I don't know, the rest of the year, and we'll be there. So thank you, though, for those of you who are sticking through and who are joining. And like I said, without further ado, let's just get jumping back in to Volume 1, Part 2, Section 3. On returning from the review, Kutuzov, accompanied by the Austrian general, went to his office and, calling his adjutant, told him to bring him certain papers pertaining to the condition of the arriving troops and letters from Archduke Ferdinand, who was heading the army of the vanguard. Prince Andrei Volokhonsky came into the commander-in-chief's office with the requested papers. Kutuzov and the Austrian member of the Hofkriegsrath was sitting over a map spread out on the table. Ah, said Kutuzov, glancing at Volokhonsky as if this word he was inviting the adjutant to wait, and went on with the conversation, begun in French. I'm saying only one thing, General, Kutuzov said with a pleasant graciousness of expression and intonation, which made one listen well to every unhurriedly uttered word. It could be seen that Kutuzov, too, listened to himself with pleasure. I'm only saying one thing, General, that if the matter depended on my personal wish, the will of His Majesty the Emperor Franz would have been fulfilled long ago. I would long ago have joined the Archduke. And believe me, on my honor, for me personally to hand over the supreme command of the army to a more knowledgeable and skillful general, such as Austria abounds in, and to lie down all this heavy responsibility, for me personally, would be a delight. But circumstances are sometimes stronger than we are, General. And Kutuzov smiled with such an expression as if he were saying, "You have every right not to believe me, and I'm even quite indifferent to whether you believe me or not, but you have no cause for telling me so, and that's the whole point." The Austrian general had a displeased look, but he had no choice but to answer Kutuzov in the same tone. "On the contrary," he said in a peevish and angry tone, quite contradictory to the flattering meaning of the words he spoke. "On the contrary, Your Excellency's participation in the common cause is highly appreciated by His Majesty, but we think that the present delay is depriving the valiant Russian army and its commanders of the laurels they are accustomed to reap in battle." He finished with an obviously prepared phrase. Kutuzov bowed with an unchanging smile. "But I am convinced, and basing myself on the last letter with which His Highness Archduke Ferdinand has honored me, I suppose that the Austrian troops under the command of so skilled a leader as General Mack have now gained a decisive victory and are no longer in need of our help," said Kutuzov. The general frowned. Though there were no positive news about the defeat of the Austrians, there were far too many circumstances confirming the general unfavorable rumors, and therefore Kutuzov's supposition about an Austrian victory looked very much like mockery. But Kutuzov was smiling meekly, with the same expression with which he had said that he had the right to suppose so. In fact, the last letter he had had from Mack's army had informed him of the victory and of the most advantageous strategic position of the army. "Give me the letter," said Kutuzov, turning to Prince Andrei. "Take a look, if you please," said Kutuzov with a mocking smile at the corner of his lips. Read in German for the Austrian general from the following passage from the letter of Archduke Ferdinand. "Wir haben willkommen." So I'm going to skip the German because Tolstoy's already thrown 2 other languages at me with less than flying colors. So there's some footnotes in our English. We'll jump down there. All right. The passage from the letter of Archduke Ferdinand. "We have a fully massed army of about 70,000 men and can attack and crush the enemy if he crosses the Lech. Since we are already the masters of Ulm, we cannot lose the advantage of being masters of both banks of the Danube, so that if the enemy does not cross the Lech, we can at any moment cross the Danube, fall upon his lines of communication, cross back lower down the Danube, and prevent the enemy, if he decides to turn all his forces against our faithful allies, from fulfilling his intention. Thus we shall cheerfully await the time when the Russian Imperial Army is in full readiness, and then together we shall easily find the means of preparing for the enemy the fate he deserves." Kutuzov sighed deeply as he finished this paragraph and looked at the member of the Hofkriegsrath attentively and benignly. "But Your Excellency knows the wise rule which prescribes that one should assume the worst," said the Austrian general, evidently wishing to put an end to the joking and get down to business. He glanced with displeasure at the adjutant. "Excuse me, General," Kutuzov interrupted him, and also turned to Prince Andrei. "I tell you what, my gentle, you get all the reports our scouts have received from Kozlovsky. Here are 2 letters from Count Nostitch. Here is the letter from His Highness Archduke Ferdinand. Here are some others," he said, handing him several papers. "And from all this compose a clear memorandum in French, presenting all the news we've had about the actions of the Austrian army. Well, do that and give it to His Excellency." Prince Andrei inclined his head to indicate that he had understood from the first word not only what had been said, but also what Kutuzov had wished to tell him. He gathered up the papers, and making a general bow, stepped softly over the carpet, went out to the waiting room. Though not much time had passed since Prince Andrei left Russia, he had changed very much during that time. In the expression of his face, in his movements, and in his gait, there was almost no trace of the former affectation, fatigue, and laziness. He had the look of a man who had no time to think of the impression he made on others, and who was occupied with pleasant and interesting things. His face expressed more satisfaction with himself and those around him. His smile and glance were more cheerful and attractive. Kutuzov, whom he had overtaken still in Poland, had received him very affectionately, promised not to forget him, distinguished him from the other adjutants, taking him along to Vienna, charged him with more serious missions. From Vienna, Kutuzov wrote to his old comrade, Prince Andrei's father. "Your son," he wrote, "promises to become an outstanding officer by his knowledge, firmness, and industry. I consider myself fortunate to have such a subordinate at hand." On Kutuzov's staff, among his comrades and colleagues, and in the army in general, as in Petersburg society, Prince Andrei had two completely opposite reputations. Some, the smaller part, considered Prince Andrei to be something distinct from themselves and from all others, expected some greatness from him, listened to him, admired him, and imitated him. And with these people, Prince Andrei was simple and pleasant. Others, the majority, did not like Prince Andrei, considering him a pompous, cold, and unpleasant man. But with these people, Prince Andrei was able to behave in such a way as to be respected and even feared. Coming out to the waiting room from Kutuzov's office, Prince Andrei, holding the papers, went up to his colleague on duty, the adjutant Kozlovsky, who was sitting by the window with a book. "Well, what is it, Prince?" said Kozlovsky. "I've been ordered to compose a memorandum explaining why we are not moving forward." "And why is it?" Prince Andrei shrugged his shoulders. "Any news from Mac?" asked Kozlovsky. "No. If it were true that he'd been defeated, the news would have come." "Probably," said Prince Andrei, and headed for the front door. But just then the door slammed and a tall Austrian general, evidently just arrived in a frock coat, his head bound in a black bandage and the Order of Maria Theresa on his neck, quickly entered the waiting room. Prince Andrei stopped. "General-in-Chief Kutuzov?" The just-arrived general spoke quickly, with a strong German accent, glancing to both sides and going to the door of the office without pausing. "The General-in-Chief is busy," said Kozlovsky, hastily going up to the unknown general and barring his way to the door. "How shall I announce you?" The unknown general looked down scornfully at the short Kozlovsky, as if surprised that there could be people who did not know him. "The General-in-Chief is busy," Kozlovsky calmly repeated. The general's face frowned. His lips twitched and trembled. He took out a notebook, quickly jotted something with a pencil, tore out the page, handed it over, and went with quick steps to the window, dropped his body into a chair, and looked around at those who were in the room, as if asking why they were looking at him. Then the general raised his head, stretched his neck as if intending to say something, but at once, as if casually beginning to hum to himself, produced a strange sound, which at once broke off. The door to the office opened, and Kutuzov appeared on the threshold. The general, with the bandaged head, leaning forward as if fleeing from danger, went up to Kutuzov with long, rapid strides of his thin legs. "Vous voyez l'air malheureux, Mac," he uttered in a breaking voice. "Ah, you are looking at the unfortunate Mac." The face of Kutuzov, who was standing in the doorway of his office, remained perfectly immobile for a few moments. Then a wrinkle pressed like a wave over his face. His brow became smooth again. He inclined his head deferentially, closed his eyes, silently allowed Mac to pass, followed him in, and closed the door behind him. The rumor that had already spread earlier about the defeat of the Austrians and the surrender of the entire army at Ulm turned out to be true. Within half an hour, adjutants had been sent out in various directions with orders demonstrating that the Russian troops, so far inactive, would soon also have to meet the enemy. Prince Andrei was one of the rare officers on the staff who placed his main interest in the general course of military operations. Seeing Mac and hearing the details of his ruin, he understood that half the campaign was lost, understood all the difficulty of the Russian troops' position, and vividly pictured to himself what awaited the army and the role he was to play in it. Involuntarily, he experienced an excited, joyful feeling at the thought of the disgrace of self-confident Austria and of the fact that in a week, perhaps, he would have to see and take part in the encounter of the Russians with the French, the first since Suvorov. But he feared the genius of Bonaparte, which might prove stronger than all the courage of the Russian troops, and at the same time he could not allow for the disgrace of his hero. Excited and irritated by these thoughts, Prince Andrei went to his room to write to his father, to whom he wrote every day. In the corridor, he met his roommate, Nesvitsky, and the joker, Zherkov. They were laughing at something, as usual. "Why so glum?" said Nesvitsky, noticing Prince Andrei's pale face with its glittering eyes. "There's nothing to be merry about," replied Volokhonsky. Just as Prince Andrei met Novitzky and Zherkov, the Austrian general Strauch, attached to Kutuzov's staff to oversee the supplying of the Russian army, came from the other end of the corridor, along with a member of the Hofkriegsrat, who had arrived the day before. The corridor was wide enough for the generals to pass the three officers unhindered, but Zherkov, pushing Novitzky aside with his hand, said in a breathless voice, "They're coming! They're coming! Step aside! Make way, please!" The generals came on, looking as if they could do without embarrassing honors. The face of the joker Zherkov suddenly showed a stupid smile of joy which he seemed unable to suppress. "Your Excellency," he said in German, stepping forward and addressing the Austrian general, "I have the honor to congratulate you." He bowed his head and began scraping with one foot, then the other, awkwardly, like children who are learning to dance. The general, who was a member of the Hofkriegsrat, looked at him sternly, but noticing the seriousness of the stupid smile, could not refuse it a moment's attention. He narrowed his eyes, showing that he was listening. "I have the honor to congratulate you. General Mack has arrived in good health, except for a slight wound here," he added with a beaming smile, pointing to his head. The general frowned, turned away, and walked on. "Gott with Nav," he said angrily, going a few steps. God, how naive. Novitzky, guffawing, put his arm around Prince Andrei, but Volokhonsky, turning still more pale, with an angry expression on his face, pushed him away and turned to Zherkov. The nervous irritation he had felt at the sight of Mack, the news of his defeat, and the thought of what awaited the Russian army now found its outlet in his anger at Zherkov's inappropriate joke. "If you, my dear sir," he began in a shrill voice with a slight trembling of the lower jaw, "wish to be a buffoon, I cannot prevent you from being one, but I announce to you that the next time you dare to clown in my presence, I will teach you how to behave." Novitzky and Zherkov were so astonished by this outburst that they silently stared wide-eyed at Volokhonsky. "Why, I only congratulated him," said Zherkov. "I am not joking with you. Kindly keep silent," shouted Volokhonsky, and taking Novitzky by the arm, he walked away from Zherkov, who was at a loss how to reply. "Well, what's with you, brother?" Novitzky said peaceably. "What's with me?" said Prince Andrei, stopping in agitation. "Understand that we're either officers serving our Tsar and fatherland and rejoice in our common success and grieve over our common failures, or we're lackeys who have nothing to do with their master's doings. Quaran-time 1000 hommes massacrés et les armées dénoncent à les détruites. Et vous trouvez le mon père rire," he said, as if clinching his opinion by this French phrase. "C'est bien pas un garçon de reine, comme cet individu dont vous avez fait un ami, mais pas pour vous, mais pour vous." "Only schoolboys can have fun like that," said Prince Andrei in Russian, pronouncing the words with a French accent, noticing that Zherkov was still within earshot. He waited for the cornet to make some reply, but the cornet turned and left the corridor. 40,000 men massacred and the army of our allies destroyed, and you find that an excuse for laughing? It's all right for a worthless fellow like that individual you have made friends with, but not for you. Not for you. Section 4. The Pavlogradsky Hussar Regiment was stationed 2 miles from Braunau. The squadron in which Nikolai Rostov served as a junker had settled in the German village of Salznek. The squadron commander, Captain Denisov, known to the whole cavalry division as Vaska Denisov, was assigned the best quarters in the village. Junker Rostov had been living with the squadron commander ever since he caught up with his regiment in Poland. On October 8th, the day when at headquarters all were brought to their feet by the news of Mack's defeat, in the squadron staff, life quietly went on as before. Denisov, who had spent the whole night playing cards, was still not home when Rostov, on horseback, came back from foraging early in the morning. Rostov, in his junker's uniform, rode up to the porch, nudged his horse around, swung his legs over in a supple, youthful movement, and stood in the stirrup as if not wishing to part from his horse, finally jumped down and shouted for the orderly. "Ah, Bondarenko, friend of my heart," he said to the hussar who came rushing for his horse. "Give him a cooling down, my friend," he said, with that merry brotherly tenderness with which all fine young men treat everyone when they are happy. Yes, Your Excellency, the Ukrainian replied, merrily shaking his head. See that you give him a cooling down. Another hussar also rushed to the horse, but Bondarenko had already thrown the reins over the horse's head. One could see that the junker gave good tips and that it was profitable to be of service to him. Rostov stroked the horse's neck, then his crop and stopped on the porch. Very nice, what a horse he'll be, he said to himself, and smiling and holding his saber, ran up the steps, his spurs jingling. The German landlord, in a vest and a cap, holding the fork he was using to clear away dung, peeked out of the cowshed. As soon as he saw Rostov, the German's face suddenly brightened. He smiled merrily and winked. Schon gut Morgen, he repeated, obviously taking pleasure in greeting the young man. Schon flässig, said Rostov, still with the same joyful brotherly smile which never left his animated face. Hoch Österreich, Hoch Russen, Kaiser Alexander Hoch, he addressed the German, repeating the words often spoken by the landlord. The German laughed, came all the way out of the cowshed door, pulled off his cap, and waving it above his head, cried, Und die Gans wird hoch. Rostov himself, like the German, waved his peaked cap above his head and laughing shouted, Und wie want die Gans wird? Though there were no particular reason for rejoicing either for the German, who was cleaning his cowshed, or for Rostov, who had gone for hay with his section. The two men looked at each other with happy delight and brotherly love, shook their heads as a sign of mutual respect, and smiling went on their way. The German to his cowshed, and Rostov to the cottage he occupied with Denisov. How's the master? He asked. Lavrushka, Denisov's lackey, a rogue known to the whole regiment. Hasn't been back since evening. Must have lost, replied Lavrushka. I know for sure if he wins, he comes early so as to boast, but if he stays away till morning, it means he blew it, and he'll come angry. Shall I serve coffee? Go on. 10 minutes later, Lavrushka brought coffee. He's coming, he said. Now for trouble. Rostov looked out the window and saw Denisov coming home. Denisov was a small man with a red face, shining black eyes, disheveled black mustache and hair. He was wearing an unbuttoned dolman, wide pleated trousers ballooning over his boots, and a crumpled hussar's cap perched on the back of his head. He was approaching the porch gloomily, his head hanging. Lavrushka, he shouted loudly and crossly. Well, take it off, blockhead. I'm taking it off, Lavrushka's voice replied. Ah, you're up already, said Denislov, going into his room. Long ago, said Rostov. I already went for hay and saw Fraulein Mathilde. Ah, really? And I blew everything last night, brother, like a son of a bitch, shouted Denisov, swallowing his R's. Such bad luck. And as soon as you left, it started. Hey, tea. Denisov, wincing as if he was smiling and baring his short, strong teeth, began tousling his 4 thick, tangled, bushy black hair with both short-fingered hands. The devil prompted me to go to that rat. The officer's nickname was the Rat, he said, rubbing his forehead and face with both hands. Can you imagine? Not a single chad, not one. Denisov took the lighted pipe served to him, clutching it in his fist, banged on the floor, spraying sparks, and went on shouting. He gives you the simple and beats it out with the parole. Gives you the simple and beats it with the parole. He spilled the fire, smashed the pipe, and threw it away. Then he paused and suddenly glanced merrily at Rostov with his shining black eyes. If only there were some women. But here, except for drinking, there's nothing to do. If only we start fighting soon. Hey, who's there? He turned to the door, hearing the tread of heavy boots with jingling spurs come to a stop, and then a respectful cough. The sergeant major, said Lavrushka. Denisov winced still more. Rotten luck, he said, throwing down a purse with a few gold pieces. Rostov, dear Hout, count up what's left and put it under the pillow, he said, and went out to the sergeant major. Rostov took the money and, mechanically sorting the old and new coins into separate piles, began counting it. Ah! Talyanen, greetings. I blew everything last night. Denisov's voice came from the other room. What? At Baikov's? At the Rats? I knew it, said a high-pitched voice. And after that, Lieutenant Telyanin, a small officer with the same squadron, came in. Rostov threw the purse under the pillow and shook the small, moist hand that was held out to him. Telyanin had, for some reason, been transferred from the Guards just before the campaign. He behaved very well in the regiment, but he was not liked, and Rostov especially could neither overcome nor conceal his causeless loathing for the man. Well, so, young cavalryman, how's my little rook serving you? He asked. Little Rook was a saddle horse, recently broken, that Telyanin had sold to Rostov. The lieutenant never looked the person he was talking to in the eye. His eyes constantly shifted from one object to another. I saw you ride by today. He's all right, a good horse, replied Rostov, although the horse, which he had bought for 700 rubles, was not worth even half that price. He's begun to favor the left foreleg, he added. The hoof's cracked. It's nothing. I'll teach you. I'll show you what sort of clinch nail to put on it. Yes, please show me, said Rostov. I will. It's no secret, and you'll be thankful for the horse. I'll have the horse brought then, said Rostov, wishing to be rid of Telyanin, and he went to give orders for the horse to be brought. In the front hall, Denisov, crouching on the threshold with his pipe, sat facing the sergeant major who was reporting something. Seeing Rostov, Denisov winced and, pointing over his shoulder with his thumb to the room where Telyanin was sitting, winced again and shuddered with loathing. Ah, I dislike the fellow, he said, unembarrassed by the sergeant major's presence. Rostov shrugged his shoulders as if to say, So do I, but what's to do? And having given orders, went back to Telyanin. Telyanin was sitting in the same indolent pose in which Rostov had left him, rubbing his small white hands. There are such repulsive faces in the world, thought Rostov, going into the room. So did you order the horse brought? Asked Telyanin, getting up and glancing around casually. I did. Well, come on then. I only stopped to ask Denisov about yesterday's orders. Did you receive them, Denisov? Not yet. And where are you going? I want to teach the young man how to shoe a horse. They went out to the porch and to the stable. The lieutenant showed him how to do a clinch nail and went home. When Rostov came back, there was a bottle of vodka and some sausage on the table. Denisov was sitting at the table scratching on a piece of paper with his quill. He glanced darkly at Rostov's face. I'm writing to her, he said. He leaned his elbow on the table with the quill in his hand and obviously glad of the chance to quickly speak out everything he wanted to write. Began reciting his letter to Rostov. You see, friend, he said, we're asleep until we love. We're children of dust. But fall in love, and your God, you are pure as on the first day of creation. And who's that now? Send him to the devil. No time, he shouted to Lavrushka, who had come up to him without the slightest timidity. Who is it? You gave the order yourself. The sergeant major's come for money. Denisov winced and was about to shout something, but kept silent. Rotten business, he said to himself. How much money was left in the purse? He asked Rostov. 7 new and 3 old. Ah, rot. Well, what are you standing there for, Scherho? Go after the sergeant major, he shouted at Lavrushka. Please, Denisov, take money from me. I've got it, said Rostov said, blushing. I don't like getting friends involved. No, I don't, Denisov muttered. If you won't take money from me as a friend, you'll offend me. I really have got it, Rostov repeated. No, I won't. And Denisov went to the bed to take his purse from under the pillow. Where'd you put it, Rostov? Under the bottom pillow. It's not there. Denisov threw both pillows on the floor. The purse was not there. That's odd. Wait, maybe you dropped it? Rostov picked up first one pillow, then the other, and shaking them. He tore off the blanket and shook it. The purse was not there. Maybe I forgot? No, I thought then and that it was as if you were hiding a treasure under your head, said Rostov. I put the purse there. Where is it? He said, turning to Lavrushka. I didn't come in. It should be wherever you put it. But it's not. It's always that way. You toss something somewhere and then forget. Look in your pockets. No, maybe if I hadn't thought about the treasure, said Rostov, but I remember putting it there. Lavrushka rummaged through the whole bed, looked under it, looked under the table, rummaged about everywhere, and stopped in the middle of the room. Denisov silently followed Lavrushka's movements, and when Lavrushka spread his arms in surprise, saying it was not to be found anywhere. He looked at Rostov. Rostov, you're not a prankster. Rostov felt Denisov's gaze on him, raised his eyes, and instantly lowered them. All the blood he had locked up somewhere under his throat rushed to his face and eyes. He could scarcely breathe. There was nobody in the room except the lieutenant and you. It's here somewhere, said Lavrushka. Ah, you devil's puppet, stir your stumps. Get looking, Denisov shouted suddenly, turning purple and hurling himself at the lackey with a menacing gesture. There'll be a price or I'll flog you to death. I'll flog you all to death. Rostov, avoiding Denisov's eyes, began to unbucket his jacket, buckled on his saber, and put on his peaked cap. I tell you there'll be a price, Denisov shouted, shaking the orderly by the shoulder, and pushed him against the wall. Denisov, leave him alone. I know who took it, said Rostov, approaching the door and not raising his eyes. Denisov paused, reflected, and evidently realizing what Rostov was alluding to, seized his arm. Rubbish, he shouted, so that the veins swelled like ropes on his neck and forehead. You've lost your mind, I tell you. I won't stand for it. The purse is here. Skin this scoundrel alive. It will be here. I know who took it, Rostov repeated in a trembling voice, going to the door. And I tell you, don't you dare do that, cried Denisov, rushing at the junker to hold him back. But Rostov tore his arm free, and with as much spite as if Denisov was his greatest enemy, directly and firmly fixed his eyes on him. Do you realize what you're saying? He said in a trembling voice. Besides me, there was no one else in the room, which means, if that's not it, then... He was unable to finish and ran out of the room. Ah, the devil take you and all the rest of them, were the last words Rostov heard. Rostov went to Telyanin's quarters. The master's not at home. He's gone to the staff, Telyanin's orderly told him. Has something happened? The orderly added, surprised to see the junker's upset face. No, nothing. You just missed him, said the orderly. The staff was quartered 2 miles from Salznek. Without stopping at home, Rostov took his horse and rode to the staff. In the village occupied by the staff, there was a tavern frequented by the officers. Rostov rode to the tavern. Near the porch, he saw Telyanin's horse. The lieutenant was sitting in the second room of the tavern over a plate of sausage and a bottle of wine. Ah, you've come too, young man, he said, smiling and raising his eyebrows high. Yes, said Rostov, as if it cost him great effort to utter this word, and sat at the next table. Both were silent. There were 2 Germans in the room and a Russian officer. Everyone was silent, and only the clank of knives against the plates were heard, and the lieutenant's chomping. When Telyanin finished his lunch, he took a double purse from his pocket, opened the clasp with his small, white, upturned fingers, took out a gold coin, raising his eyebrows, gave it to the waiter. Make it quick, please, he said. The coin was a new one. Rostov got up and went over to Telyanin. May I look at your purse? He said in a low, barely audible voice. With shifty eyes, but still raising his eyebrows, Telyanin handed him the purse. Yes, a pretty purse. Yes, he said, and suddenly turned pale. Have a look, young man, he added. Rostov took the purse in his hands and looked at it, and at the money that was in it, and at Telyanin. The lieutenant glanced about, as was his habit, and suddenly seemed to become very merry. If we get to Vienna, I'll leave it all there, but there's nothing to do with it in these trashy little towns, he said. Well, young man, give it to me. I'm leaving. Rostov was silent. And why are you here? Also to have lunch? The food's quite good, Telyanin went on. Give it to me. He reached out and put his hand on the purse. Rostov let go of it. Telyanin took the purse and began to lower it into the pocket of his riding breeches. His eyebrows raised casually and his mouth slightly opened as if he were saying, Yes, I'm putting my purse in my pocket. It's quite simple, and it's nobody's business. Well then, young man, he said, sighing and looking into Rostov's eyes from under his raised eyebrows. Some sort of light, quick as an electric spark, passed from Telyanin's eyes to the eyes of Rostov, and back, forth and back again, all in an instant. Come here, said Rostov, seizing Telyanin by the arm. He almost dragged him to the window. That's Denisov's money. You took it, he whispered in his ear. What? How dare you? What? Said Telyanin. But these words sounded like a pitiful, desperate cry and a plea for forgiveness. As soon as Rostov heard the sound of that voice, a huge burden of doubt fell from his soul. He felt joy, and in that same instant also pity for the wretched man standing before him, but he had to bring the matter he had begun to a conclusion. God knows what the people here may think, Telyanin muttered, seizing his peaked cap and going into a small empty room. We must have a talk. I know it, and I'll prove it, said Rostov. Aye, Every muscle in Telynin's frightened, pale face began to quiver. His eyes shifted as before, but somewhere low down, not rising to Rostov's face, and there was a sound of sobbing. Count, don't ruin a young man. Here's this wretched money. Take it. He threw it on the table. I have an old father, a mother. Rostov took the money, avoiding Telynin's eyes, and not saying a word, started out of the room. But at the door he stopped and came back. My God, he said with tears in his eyes, how could you have done it? Count, said Telynin, going up to the junker. Don't touch me, said Rostov, drawing back. If you need the money, take it. He flung the purse at him and ran out of the tavern. Section 5. Ooh. Intrigue. So, we're going to stop there for today. And I don't know if anyone has interesting thoughts about that. Slimy character. And remember, Nikolai, so Rostov is the son of the count that had that big party, Nikolai Rostov, and he's the one where him and his cousin kind of have this relationship, but there's also that other young lady who kind of likes him. So he's still a young man. But he's a young man who comes from a good family with money. So he's obviously got, a good cushy aid job and has money to buy a horse, even though he has to outfit himself as a soldier. And so I'm not sure how old this other chap is, but it sounds like he's a little bit older, this kind of slimy fellow who did the stealing. So it's interesting that this young, he's probably I think he's 16, 17, is confronting him, and, with all that fervor of a sort of idealistic young man. But interesting to see what happens next. And as a note, sometimes it sounds like I'm pronouncing things strangely, or if I'm giving things a strange voice, like the captain that Nikolai Rostov is serving under. It's written in that he has this sort of weird pronunciation. There's an extra GH in a bunch of his words. So I'm not making up that strange accent. I'm literally just trying to do the best I can with the strange way he's written out. So if you're wondering why I sometimes there is me just trying to give an accent based on what the characters are saying, or if there's a bunch of people talking, trying to differentiate. But in the case of something like that, it's clearly written in. So I'm not trying to take crazy liberties here with the characters. Yeah. There was a section where in the last one, where some of the soldiers were pronouncing Bonaparte like Bonaparte, and instead of Braunau, they were pronouncing the city as Bronova, and that's how it was written out. So I think that's kind of interesting that Tolstoy kind of, especially in the 1800s, where I don't know how much of that was that dialogue was really recorded. He was really giving his characters very individual voices. So something interesting. Yeah. So thank you all for tuning in. We'll be back again tomorrow at 3. And thank you on the chat, and thank you for tuning in. See you guys tomorrow. Have a great rest of your Tuesday. Stay safe. Stay healthy.